Taib Saleh was born in 1929 in Ash-Shamaliya province in the Sudan. He died in London in 2009. Saleh, an Arabic language novelist and short story writer. He attended universities in Khartoum and in London. He worked in radio broadcasting as head of drama for BBC Arabic Service. The novel that you will be reading this week, Season of Migration to the North, Mawsim al-Hijra ila al-Shamal, referred to usually as Mawsim, was published in 1966, translated into English in 1969, is a prose poem that deals with the conflicts of modern Africa, such as traditionalism versus modernism, rural versus urban, man versus woman, and the village, the specific versus the universal. He also wrote Ars Zain, The Wedding of Zain, and other stories. Now, I'll start by quoting some parts from Saleh's lecture at AUB, way before you were born, in 1980. On May 19, 1980, Taib Saleh gave a lecture at AUB on his novel. The following are excerpts from the transcription of the recorded lecture published in the casebook by late Professor Muna Amyouni. He starts by saying, "I have never before addressed such an enormous crowd. I don't really know whether a writer can say anything about his work, above and beyond what he has already said. I started Season in the summer of 1960 when on a holiday in a little village near Cannes. I got stuck before Mustafa Said started his Confessions. I fell under the influence of Freud and read more than once Civilization and Its Discontents, what you read at the beginning of the semester. But above everything else, the foundation of my work, for what it is worth, lies in what I am, a Sudanese Muslim Arab who was born at a certain time in a certain place. I believe that if I have contributed anything to modern Arabic literature, it is my constant plea for toleration. One of the major themes of Season is the East-West confrontation, or to be more specific, the confrontation between the Arab Muslim world and the Western European one. He ends by saying, "I created, therefore, a conflicting world in which nothing is certain, and formalistically two voices to force the reader to make up his or her mind." We have already encountered the East-West, self-other, Occident-Orient relationship or confrontation in Edward Said's Orientalism. Said argues that Orientalism tries to show that European culture gained in strength and identity by setting itself off against the Orient as a sort of surrogate and underground self. Said describes the positional superiority of the West, where Europe was always in a position of strength, not to say domination. According to Edward Said, Orientalism promoted the difference between the West, the self, and the Orient, the other, and deepened the distinction, always reiterating Western superiority over Oriental backwardness, expressing the strength of the West and the weakness of the Orient. The result of such divisions is a state of tension that polarizes the distinction between the familiar, the West, and the strange, the Orient. The Oriental becomes more Oriental, the Westerner more Western, and limit the human encounter between different cultures, traditions, and societies. we will encounter the same vision of polarization, tension, and division between East and West, the South and the North, more specifically the Sudan and Imperial England in موسم الهجرة إلى الشمال. The two voices in season, already mentioned before, are those of Al-Rawi, the narrator, and Mustafa Said. Please don't confuse the narrator with the author, Tayyib Saleh. The narrator remains anonymous till the very end of the novel. Critics and readers have different views on the representative figure and main voice in the novel. Is it the anonymous, nameless narrator, or is it Mustafa Said? Both stand for two Sudanese who lived and studied in England, but the relationship with the West, with the North, is quite dissimilar. The narrator considers the coming of the British was neither a tragedy nor yet a blessing. Mustafa Said has a relationship of defiance with the West. He poisons his life trying to avenge the defeat of the Sudanese, the colonization of the East, engages in sexual relationships with English women, and kills one of them. 3 commit suicide, possibly because of him. Sheila Greenwood, a waitress in a restaurant, Isabella Seymour, wife of a successful surgeon and mother of 2 daughters and a son, and the third one is Anne Hammond, a university student. Jean Morris is the woman he falls in love with, marries, and kills with a sharp blade on a cold February evening. Now I will discuss the colonial context of the novel. The novel cannot be understood outside the historical and colonial and post-colonial Arab discourse. It was in September 1898 that the forces of imperialism, the British Army led by Herbert Kitchener, invaded the Sudan. Muhammad Ahmad, a religious leader who challenged the power of British occupation of Egypt, was able to end Egyptian rule in the Sudan in the 1880s. He drew his inspiration from Sufism, and he was able to create a state based upon Islam and modeled upon the community of the Prophet was Sahaba and his companions. After his death, the Khalifa carried on the state, which was ended by British occupation. Note the date, 1898. The reforming and foreign governments felt the fear of such religious movements and attempted to oppose or control them. It was at Durman, on the banks of the Nile, that witnessed the East-West, South-North confrontation. The battle was between the Sudanese desert tribesmen, who numbered around 52,000, against the military might of the biggest empire, and Kitchener's men were around 20,000. The Sudanese had swords and spears. The British had guns and rifles. The battle was over in 5 hours, and Kitchener remarked arrogantly that the enemy had been given a good dusting. In the novel, Kitchener says to Mahmoud Wad Ahmad, after his defeat at the Battle of Atbara, "Why have you come to my country to lay waste and plunder?" It was the intruder, the colonizer, who said this to the person whose land it was, and the owner of the land bowed his head and said nothing. Mustafa Said resumes the Battle of Durman more than 3 decades later, with the same spears and swords, the victims being the British women rather than the British army. He says, I resumed the war with bow and sword, and spear and arrows. The city was transformed into an extraordinary woman, and with her symbols and her mysterious calls, towards whom I drove my camels. Now, the contact between the Arab world and the Western one during the Nahda signaled the beginning of the debate between traditionalism and modernism. The term, for those who don't know, Nahda, literally it means awakening, yaqza, or Renaissance, covers the period from the mid or late 19th century to the present. During this period, the impact of the West became a major factor in the Arab social and political life. Europe, as the self, recognized itself as different from the non-modern other, the Orient. With the expanding power of Europe, the question to be answered was the following: how could Arab Muslims acquire the strength to confront Europe and become part of the modern world? The Arab awakening can be seen as a struggle between two standpoints. The first adhered to Islam as a source of legitimacy. The second took the West, Europe, mainly Western Europe, as a model to aspire to. Many regarded modernity as uniquely and strictly a European phenomenon. The most prominent representatives of the Islamic modernists or reformers, like Rafa' al-Tahtawi, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, and Muhammad Abdu, were opposed to Western domination, but appreciated the Western scientific and cultural achievements. They realized that living in the modern world requires certain changes, which could be carried out while Muslims remain true to themselves and the purity of early Islam. In conclusion, the religious reformers aimed at the following. They tried to reconcile tradition and modernity, hoping that the Muslim world can overcome the challenges it was facing. They stressed the need to return to the original source of Islam. But Taha Hussein, a famous novelist and prominent literary figure, took the second position. The West should be taken as a model to imitate. He asserted that we must follow the path of the Europeans as to be their equals and partners in civilization, in its good and evil, its sweetness and bitterness, what can be loved or hated, what can be praised or blamed. Now I will examine the first voice, the narrator in the novel. He felt ريشة في مهب الريح, a storm-swept feather in the north. So he was the other in England, and he was ريشة في مهب الريح, a storm-swept feather in the south, the other in his own country among his own people. A strong feeling of تغريب, estrangement. The first page of Season announces the return of the narrator to his people after an absence of 7 years in England, where he received a doctorate degree in English literature. He rejoices leaving the coldness of England and returning to the warmth of his people in that small village at the bend of the Nile. He returns with great yearning, الحنين, and feels a sense of stability. He says, I felt not like a storm-swept feather, but like that palm tree, a being with a background, with roots, with a purpose. These feelings are reassured every time he visits his grandfather, Hajj Ahmad. He reveals a desire to seek roots in the village and to re-engage himself in his society and culture. The grandfather stands for the traditional, immutable man who has the secret of life, and it is to live simply and die simply. عدم الإسراف في الحياة. A simple and traditional life that both the narrator and Mustafa Saeed were not able to lead. Contrary to Mustafa, the narrator considers the North is very much like the South. This is a very important page in your novel, page 49. He says, over there is like here, neither better nor worse. But I am from here, just as the date palm standing in the courtyard of our house has grown in our house and not in anyone else's. The fact that they, i.e. the British, came to our land, I know not why. Does that mean we should poison our present and our future? Sooner or later, they will leave our country. The railways, ships, hospitals, factories, and schools will be ours. After spending some time in his village, the narrator goes to Khartoum to teach pre-Islamic Arabic poetry at a secondary school. He feels that life is good for him and the world remains the same. Yet the narrator has not remained the same, contrary to his affirmation that I too had lived with them, i.e. the British, but I had lived with them superficially, neither loving nor hating them. According to the narrator, imperialism and the coming of the British was neither a tragedy nor yet a blessing. This view differs radically from that of Mustafa Saeed, as we shall see later in the lecture. The narrator idealizes his country and his people, only to realize later that things have changed and the world has turned upside down. No sooner does he find that the love he wants to flow from his heart has turned into rage and anger. Mustafa Saeed disappears one day by drowning or more possibly by suicide. We don't know. And he leaves his wife Husna and the two boys in the care of the narrator. The narrator falls in love with Husna bint Mahmoud, yet he does nothing. He does not let love flow from his heart, as he claims at the beginning of season, where he says, I want to give lavishly, I want love to flow from my heart, to ripen and bear fruit. Now, there are two reasons for the crisis of internal migration of the narrator. So you have the geographic migration in your title, now the internal migration, the alienation of the narrator. First reason is patriarchy and tragedy. Second reason is the corruption of the new rulers of Africa. I'll start by discussing the patriarchal social structure in the Sudan. Wad Rais, a 70-year-old man, much married and much divorced, wants to marry Husna, who is very decisive when she says she will go to no man after Mustafa Saeed, and threatens to kill him and kill herself if they force her to marry him. In that small village at the bend of the Nile, we see the same duality between the self and the other that Simone de Beauvoir refers to in The Second Sex. A woman is simply what man decrees. She is the incidental, the inessential, as opposed to the essential. He is the subject, he is the absolute, she is the other. Wad Rais argues that men are guardians of woman, and that she will marry him whether she likes it or not. He says that God, in his noble book, said that النساء والبنون زينة الحياة, which is totally wrong. Women and children are the adornment of life, only to be corrected by the narrator who recites the verse as it stands in the Quran. It is wealth and children, al-mal wal-banun, are the adornment of life. Her father forces her to marry him, and after the marriage, she kills him and kills herself. Mabruka, Wadreyes' first wife, and the narrator are the only two people in the village who do not curse Husna. However, the reasons for that are quite different. The narrator confesses that Husna bint Mahmud was the only woman he had loved. Haj Ahmad prays to God to rest the soul of Wadreyes, يعني عم يترحم عليه. Curses all women whom he considers as sisters of the devil. Second reason for the internal crisis and alienation of the narrator is neocolonialism, the corruption of the new rulers of Africa. The alienation of the narrator multiplies. He attends a conference of the Ministry of Education to discuss ways of unifying Tawheed al-Manahij, unifying the educational methods. The conference is held in the Independence Hall. Notice the name of the hall. In a hotel in Khartoum. The hall was designed in London, the white marble imported from Italy, and the ministers are dressed in expensive silk, mohair, and cashmere. The cost of the hall, £1 million, and the wealth of the ministers stand in sharp contrast to the poverty of the Sudanese, who lack schools, who lack hospitals. The minister, in his speech, considers the bourgeoisie as being more dangerous to the future of Africa than imperialism. But it is the same minister, the same person, who leads a bourgeois life. He is known to be corrupt and has amassed a fortune from the sweat of the poor, wretched, half-naked people in the jungle. The narrator starts considering going back to the north. He says, "There is no room for me here. Why don't I pack up and go?" Remember Al-Hanin at the beginning, now the need to leave. The migration that appears in the title of the book involves not only geographic migration, but also the internal migration of the narrator, who starts feeling the coldness rather than the warmth of his own people. Twice in the novel does the narrator say, "There is no justice or moderation in the world." The first time he says this statement is after attending the conference in Khartoum. The second time, when he describes the courtroom scene in England, where Isabella Seymour's husband stands to defend his wife in spite of the fact that she confessed to him her relationship with Mustafa. He says he feels no bitterness towards her and expresses his deep sadness at losing her. The narrator feels bitterness and hatred. The unfaithful wife is defended by her husband, while the faithful Husna in that patriarchal village suffers a tragic fate. He says, "I feel bitterness and hatred, for after all those victims, he crowned his life yet with another one, Husna bint Mahmud, the only woman I have ever loved." Now I will examine the second voice. Feel free to decide who is the protagonist, the narrator or Mustafa Said. Have your own reading of the novel. Mustafa Said is the second voice in season. We can notice the dissimilarity with the narrator from the first few pages, and clearly after he starts his confession on page 19. So you have an autobiography within the novel. It is specifically on this page that the author, Tayyib Saleh, got stuck and read more than once Freud's Civilization and its discontents, especially Freud's theory of man as divided between Eros and Thanatos. Mustafa Said proves to be the prototype of the Freudian man. Mustafa Said was born in Khartoum, 1898. Notice the date. It is the same year of the Battle of Durman. He decides to avenge the colonization of the Sudan, but under his own terms. He conceives his relationship with the English woman as a battle, inflicting pain and suffering on them, and treating his victims exactly as Kitchener treated his native people. You see the reversal of roles. As a child, he was raised by his mother. His father died before he was born. He lives with her like strangers, and they act as relatives to each other. He is described as isolated, arrogant. His mind is like a sharp knife, and his heart is as cold as a piece of ice. Nothing in the world could shake him. There are 3 stops in his life. He pursues his education first in the Sudan, then attends a British school in Cairo, and then leaves to London, where he receives a doctorate degree in economics from the University of London. He says, "The mysterious call led me to the coast of Dover, to London, and tragedy." He lives in England for 30 years, but is insensitive to its beauty and enjoys nothing. Mustafa is concerned only with his campaign of inflicting pain and suffering upon the English woman. He uses terms of Arab military campaigns every time he goes out to find a new woman, a new victim. He says, "By day I lived with the theories of Keynes and Tony, and at night I resumed the war with bow and sword and spear and arrows." It's the same weapons that the Sudanese used at the Battle of Durman. He saddles his camels, refers to the Arab army conquering Spain in the 8th century, and claims, of course it's a lie, that one of his forefathers was a soldier in Tariq ibn Ziyad's army. The connection in Mustafa Said's mind between sexual conquest and his war on British colonialism is very evident. The description of his sexual conquests are similar to the description of a military conquest. He says, "Yes, my dear sirs, I came as an invader into your very homes, a drop of the poison which you have injected into the veins of history." If we examine Mustafa Said's character outside the historical and colonial context, his role will be reduced to a seducer and womanizer who's concerned with sexual fantasy and filling his bed with a different woman every night. His bedroom becomes a battlefield, a theater of war. I will discuss now the 3 levels of Mustafa Said's character. First one is the Freudian level. Mustafa Said represents, on one level, a man divided between Eros and Thanatos. The death instinct is directed inward towards himself and outward towards his woman victims. He confesses in the courtroom that he killed Jane Morris and killed her intentionally, as if he wants to die in the North, but they sentence him to imprisonment of 7 years. The distant call still rings in his ears. It's futile to deceive oneself. That distant call, he says, still rings in my ears. I thought that my life and marriage here would silence it. As for Jane Morris, he marries her after pursuing her for 3 years. He knows she's a woman who abstains from nothing, cheating, lying, or stealing. He knows that she's being unfaithful to him and often asks himself what it was that bound him to her. The natural reaction is for him to leave her. Instead, he obeys the pleasure principle and decides to stay with her, completely controlled by his id, given in to his desires. His love to her is the icy battlefield from which he would not make a safe return. He is the sailor and she is the shore of destruction. I was in torment, Mustafa says, and in a way I could not understand. I derived pleasure from my suffering. The second level of his character is south-north dichotomy, a love-hatred relationship. Mustafa Said's relationship with the West is one of defiance and yearning. There are many times, more than 5 times in the novel, where he says that he is South that yearns for the ice and for the cold. His apartment in London is full of Persian rugs, and the narrator, visiting his secret room in the Sudan, describes it as a graveyard, a huge joke. It is packed with English books and not a single Arabic book. It has a fireplace and Victorian chairs, which means his room in the Sudan resembles very much an English apartment, but planted in a totally different cultural space, while his apartment in London resembles very much an Oriental room. His love to Jane Morris unfolds the same dichotomy: love, defiance, and hatred. After putting the blade edge between her breasts, he confesses his love to her. He considers it the night of truth and the night of tragedy. The third level, Mustafa is both the conqueror and the conquered. I have come to you as a conqueror, are his words every time a new victim, a new woman, falls for him. The narrator describes it as a melodramatic phrase, unable to forget that he is at the same time the Arab African. He tells Isabella Seymour, I seek not glory, for the likes of me do not seek glory. The two halves of Mustafa Said represent the Sudanese traditional man. He has this schizophrenic duality, and the modern London intellectual, the economist and university lecturer. Nowhere does he emerge in the novel as fully traditional or fully modern. He is not a truly modern individual, nor a genuinely traditional one, probably because of the impact of both forces on him, his past identity and his Western experience and education. In the secret room, the narrator finds an unwritten biography of Mustafa with one-line dedication. Opening a notebook, I read on the first page, my life story. On the next page was the dedication. To those who see with one eye, speak with one tongue, and see things as either black or white, either Eastern or Western. Probably this dedication limits any kind of human encounter between the East and the West. Or probably another interpretation is maybe his life story is dedicated to someone, to those who see the coming of the British as a blessing, or those who see the coming of the British as a tragedy. So they see with one eye only. The narrator speaks of the railways, ships, hospitals, and factories and schools that will be ours soon. What Mustafa Said establishes is a different fact. The ships, he says, the ships sailing down the Nile were carrying guns, not bread. The railways were set up to transport troops. And the schools were started to teach the Sudanese how to say yes in English. I hope you still remember the cultural domination that Gramsci speaks of in Orientalism. And lastly, the many contradictory selves of Mustafa Said. Mustafa lives and becomes a lie. He is Hassan, Charles, Amin, Mustafa, and Richard. When Isabella Seymour asks him about his race, he answers, I'm like Othello, Arab African. Addresses the jury and prosecutors in the courtroom saying, I am no Othello, I am a lie. So who is Othello? Why don't you come up?
So Othello is a character from one of Shakespeare's plays, The Tragedy of Othello, the Venetian Moor. And basically Othello was famous because he was different by color, by race, by culture. But he was valuable to the state in Venice because of his abilities as a soldier and as a leader. Othello recognized that he was different, and he most of the time portrayed himself as someone who was different. And what's interesting is that in the play he was, at least until the Act 2, he was referred to as he or him, or he was referred to with racial slurs like the Moor, the Black Ram, or the Barbar Horse. Mm-hmm. And it was a way of recognizing him as the other, in opposed to what was around him. Yeah, he kept his identity.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. So in the courtroom, who says, I am no Othello? To Isabella, he says, I'm like Othello. Why don't you sentence me to be hanged and so kill the lie? Othello is the Moor of Venice, Berber, the tragic man, a hero with a flaw. Following his instincts and irrational desires, believes that his loyal wife, Desdemona, the blonde Italian, is a whore on the slightest of evidence, smothers her with a pillow on their marriage bed. He says, Othello, speak of me as I am, then must you speak of one that loved not wisely, but too well. These were Othello's last words before stabbing himself. So you can draw the analogy between the suicide of Mustafa Said and Othello stabbing himself, killing Jane Morris and killing Desdemona. Conclusion. Your suffering will be over in 2 minutes. At the end of the novel, we find the narrator trapped halfway in the river, between south and north. And for the first time in his life, he takes a decision. The decision to stay in the Sudan. All my life, I had not chosen, had not decided. Now I'm making a decision. I choose life. And like a comic actor shouting on stage, I screamed with all my remaining strength, help, help. Now, I leave it up to you to class discussion to decide if it's a pessimistic end or an optimistic end, or both at the same time. As for Mustafa Said, if his intellect and knowledge were used to develop the South, his struggle to avenge the Sudanese would have led him to the Sudan and not to London, to Victoria Station, and to tragedy. He loved his country too well, but not wisely. Thank you for your attention.